That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Only Human. This is episode 52. So if you're joining us for the first time, you're in for a real treat today. We're going to have a special guest, and I will introduce her in just a moment. But I want to just give a quick overview of what we're talking about over this podcast and the next two. So this season 2, we've been talking exclusively about knowing ourselves. As Socrates says, the font of all wisdom. Today, we're going to talk about courage and fear. A couple of topics that seem to go together, but we'll even talk about what happens when you've got one and not the other today a little bit, which is kind of an intriguing thought journey for us. But before we get going too far, I want to get started like we always do with our Blue Threat Proverb of the Week. It's one we've used before, but is absolutely apropos for talking about courage and fear. It's Blue Threat Proverb number 11, and it says, "You can control the sail, but not the wind." You can control the sail, but not the wind. So I think you probably get the metaphor. The wind is the challenges we face, the things that happen to us in life. Sometimes they're calm and sometimes they're 10 knots exactly in the direction where we want to go. And sometimes it's gale force winds blowing in when we least expect them and we're unprepared. And all we can do is navigate inside of those winds with the skills that we have. But the skills we have at the moment are the skills we've taken the time to think about and develop. And that's why we have our guest here today. To help guide us here today, we have best-selling author Valerie Walsh. Valerie comes to us out of the aviation profession, like me and many of you who are watching. But it's her work as a researcher and an author and a public speaker, motivator, that's at the heart of what we want to discover today about courage and fear. I kind of call courage and fear the bookends of any serious challenge, right? And we'll talk about which comes first and all that stuff here in a little bit. But Valerie's the author of 2 books. I think there's only 2 right now. Hopefully we'll see a lot more because I love the 2 she's written. The first is called Shattered to the Core. And her second book is called Courageous. That's C-O-R-E, Rageous. Should have the covers up. I really think you should buy them both and read them. They're exceptional reads. And we're going to learn a lot more about them here today. So with that, hi, Valerie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Tony. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. You're very, very welcome. So I want to ask you a question that will kind of get us rolling a little bit here. What prompted you to decide to be an author?
Well, I call it like it was happenstance. I didn't intentionally set out to be a writer. It was at a period of time in my life back in 2013. I lost my mother in a very tragic way. So my mother had died by suicide. And then shortly after that, and I say that because it's really important for me to state that. I don't always state that on a show, but it pertains a lot to what we're about to talk about. So when she passed away, shortly after that, I went through my own health scares and, lifey stuff. And the medical journey that I was on, I wrote notes about because I remember prior to that going through a different medical crisis and everyone kept asking me questions, but I forgot a lot of the details. So I knew with this one, I'm like, oh, I better take some notes in case somebody were to ask me what doctor did you go to or what were the next steps? I wanted to have some frame of reference. So what ended up happening, Tony, was I found that I was journaling more about not the clinical things, but rather going through this medical crisis without my mom. Mm-hmm. And then years later, when we weren't flying much during COVID, I had all of these journal entries and these writings that I reflected on and went back to and penned a manuscript. So it wasn't like I set out to write this book. It was kind of like that found me, and it was all part of my healing.
Oh, wow. What a story. And I think, first of all, I'm so sorry about everything you've had to go through. Your path sounds a lot like my path in that not quite as close and personal, but I was reflecting on some things that occurred pre-COVID to people that I knew, military colleagues, and I think the thing I'd like the audience to get here is that I too am a journaler, and that's kind of a weird word. People go, oh yeah, break out the incense and the Tibetan prayer chimes. Journaling doesn't have to be. I mean, I journal in little government issued green books, and my journals might be a Venn diagram or just a mind map I'm thinking about, or a single note I write down. But I never go anywhere without my book and without a pen, and I tend to maybe use 4 or 5% of what I actually write down. But I think I'd like to talk just for a second about how powerful that practice is. When did you start journaling?
It was funny because when my book was published, when my memoir, because I wrote, like you mentioned, and thank you for mentioning both of those. I always loved when I heard you speak the first time. You're like, Anne, I don't like to mention my books, but you can find them on da da da. So when I first, when my memoir first came out, I used to joke around, like it was hard to, and I think you could appreciate this, say, I'm an author. Oh yeah, I'm a published author. And I wasn't really that into writing. And then some of my schoolmates from, all the way from middle school reminded me of, you were always a writer, Valerie. And they shared these poems that I had penned like in middle school and whatnot. So I probably started at a very young age writing. Somewhere along the lines, I, became a mom and busy with other life stuff. And I really wasn't writing too much at all. And then when I picked it back up, as you said, like, how you journal it was a way of, I started to cope with the loss of my mom, but it's morphed and it's just changed into so much more. I mean, I same thing. I have pieces of paper. I'll take things like a lot of my stuff, my feedback and my ideas come when I'm exercising. That's when I feel like I'm most creative. So a lot of my journal entries will be in the notes of my phone. And so I still do that, to this day.
Yeah. I think, that's important. And I wanted the listeners to get that, because I think one of the ways that we don't know ourselves is we forget, right? We'll have this great idea, or we'll have an emotional moment or an epiphany or whatever you want to call it, and it passes and it feels good at the moment, but we don't capture those lessons. And so, I started out just taking notes at military briefings, which is what everybody does as long as they're unclassified, right? And that just carried on into my civilian life, because there's so many things going on. I needed to write them all down. And so that's just always been a natural thing for me. But if it's not for any of you listeners, please consider that. I know it's kind of off the topic of courage and fear here, but it's definitely on the topic of getting to know yourself. Write stuff down, right? I always like, down on paper, off your mind, but also down on paper, and you'll be able to recall it. It's funny, we were talking just before we started the podcast about having dogs around. And I said, when my pool guy comes down the driveway, you're going to hear mine out in the distance. He must be here. So I apologize if you guys are hearing my dogs outside. Listen, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your books, obviously, here. And you can refer to them whenever you want to. And here's, you kind of outed me by saying one of the things I usually say on stage is I think it's cheesy for authors to step up and talk about their books. So I won't tell you, they're all available on Amazon.com, maybe even with a Christmas sale. hey, the reason I write is not to be famous or get to, give speeches or anything like that. I write because I want this to be available to other people. And I suspect you wanted your lessons to get out there too. So to me, it's not vain or inglamorous to push the things that you want people to have, that you put literally thousands of hours into to give to them. So don't be bashful about that at all. I'm certainly not. So here's a question I have for you. I've got this really, I think it's this brilliant thing. It's probably not. But I said in the very beginning that courage and fear seem to go together, right? But we can get in trouble when they don't. Ooh, sounds really mysterious, right? Here's what I mean. If you have fear, but you don't have any courage, you're paralyzed, right? You're in a constant state of stress. Okay? And I think that's a lot of what you talk about in your books. But here's the other side, one that I think guys see more often. If you've got courage without fear, that equals recklessness, right? So there's some sort of cosmic balance between these two terms, right? And we all, when we think about loss, we think about fear, sadness, depression, and how it takes courage to overcome what could become paralysis, permanent paralysis. But I also want us to think a little bit about the other side when we build that courage and we don't still respect the environment, right? When we maybe think that sail is good enough to handle any gale force wind. So what do you think about that brilliant observation, man?
I think you just described the cowardly lion.
Cowardly lion. All right, I like it.
Because for a lot of my life, I operated in that fight or flight pattern, from that emotional side of my brain, which we all acknowledge, like there's fear there and that's good. Like it keeps us right size. It's there for a reason. But if we make decisions based off just those emotions, whatever they are, we're talking about fear right now, that's when we start getting into trouble. For me, it's like, courage is like, I like to honor the small things. Like, we always think of the big grand things that are celebrated with medals or rewards or accolades or whatever it might be. But I look at, because I'm a mental health advocate, like those small decisions people make every day, and to shine the light on how courageous that is huge. And what I mean by that is people who are operating from a place of anxiety or fear or have really challenging life circumstances, but have learned a skill or a mindset of tools that help them maybe not conquer that fear, but at least, do the next right thing and make good decisions. That's all courageous. That's all to be acknowledged. So I think that for me, like courage is, you can honor that fear, you can acknowledge it, but what are the decisions you're going to make to do the next right thing, to make the good choice? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Conscious decision. That's courageous.
So you mentioned some of the things people can do. What are some of those things? What is what's the essence of your approach to this?
So the essence of my approach to this, if I could share like this little story, I don't know if you've ever heard of a leadership coach. His name is Tim Kite.
The name's familiar.
Yeah. So if you probably have read some of his stuff. Anyhow, because again, a lot of what we're talking about, it's not like reinventing the wheel. We might be wording it in a different way because we all have different perspectives and we all learn from one another. One of the biggest influences in my life back when I was in my fitness career, because I had 25 plus years before I got into aviation as a fitness coach, and I managed a large multi-purpose gym. So I gravitated toward this one leadership coach. His name is Tim Kite. He's no longer with us, but his business is run by his family. And when I wrote Courageous, I had the courage and the audacity to email him and ask him, hey, would you consider writing the foreword in my book? To which he politely declined. But he said, I'd be happy to hop on a Zoom with you and talk a little bit about what you've sent me so far, because I really like what you're doing here. And long story short, he took my title, which I had always had titled the way it's meant. And people, it's not a misspelling. It's spelled C-O-R-E, courageous, purposely, because core is your heart. So Tim kindly reminded me that C-O-R really is your heart center. And everything that I talk about in courageous is how we make decisions in our life to live our most authentic lives. So every chapter gives like a short story about things I've gone through and, mistakes and life lessons or whatever, and what I did to take those lessons and make better decisions, for my future, for my family's future. So that acronym CORE is what I use, what I used to use with my training clients, but what I use now in my leadership skills, which is the C stands for your challenge, whatever your goal might be. Maybe it's as simple as something like, I'm not very versed in Excel, so I'd like to learn a little bit more about Excel. What is the outcome that you want? Well, we can't always control that. We might have our ideas of what we'd like to see, but we can't always control that. So we have to have that resiliency, which I know, you're a huge advocate for. And then your R is always your why, your reason. And E, circle back to your question, is how we're going to execute to get the outcome that we want. What are the tools we're going to pick up? So that all depends on what your goal is. So if it's getting back to that goal of, I want to become more proficient in my computer skills, well, guess what? You're going to have the courage to get up every day and hop on a YouTube video or go to a seminar at your local library or do whatever it might be to get closer to your goals. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's mindset related for me.
Yeah. So those, for those that are listening on their drive to work, they're trying to go back and say, what was the O for? Just run them down for me. C is for challenge.
Challenge. Yep.
O is for
outcome.
R is for
your why, your reason. What is your reason?
And E is
execution. What are the tools you're going to pick up? How are you going to execute this?
Challenge, outcome, reason, and execution. CORE. Very good. So let's drill down a little bit into. I'm going to pick the last one just because I believe that it will illuminate some of the others. How do we execute against a challenge that is, pick a big one, pick a small one, but one that evokes the emotional side of us? We've talked a lot on this podcast about just the physiology of emotions and how it can override large centers in our brain. It can make us, super strong, but also super dumb. All the catecholamines that flood into our system when we're triggered on emotions. So let's just say we have one of those things. Talk a little bit about some of the techniques that you would suggest for managing those moments from the execution side.
Well, I know you had said that I'm a researcher. I'm a researcher of my own story. So that's all I can tell is how it relates to me. And what has worked for me may not work for somebody else. Like if I told somebody, hey, just meditate through it, they're like, what? What does that even mean? So I think the first thing that anybody has to do is address the fact that they're feeling a certain way, right? And that in and of itself is courageous because for most of my life, I didn't do that. I did fake it till you make it. I was raised by a single mom who put on that like fake fine mask and just kind of went to work. So I think that, what I've learned is to address how I'm feeling, to then take a little bit of time to kind of adjust. Like, okay, today I'm waking up, I'm feeling this certain way. This really stunk. It didn't go my way this morning. I talk about a lot of in the morning time, like, okay, spill a cup of coffee. We're just going to reset that. We are not starting our day that way. So I think, what I'm trying to say is I think you have to recognize it. And then some of the things that have worked for me, let's just say, for example, I'll use the example of maybe it's an email that you received at work, okay? And you might have read into it in a way that it wasn't meant. And you might be feeling a certain way because you're operating from that emotional side of your brain. I would pause. I've learned to pause, give it a 24-hour rule if it doesn't need to be addressed. And then usually I can look at it through a clearer lens. So that's like a very important professional tool that I've learned to pick up, is that tool of pause, that I've also applied in a lot of other areas of my life that my kids could probably attest to, that have been beneficiaries of that pause. So that's one specific example.
Yeah, and I mean, the neuroscience research would back you up on that, because emotions fade. I mean, some of these chemicals that are in your body are called one pass-through chemicals, right? Like epinephrine, norepinephrine, those things that flood into that come in as adrenaline. Now, those are going to stick with you. But some of the other ones are called one pass-through chemicals, meaning one deep breath and they're metabolized out of your system, right? But the key is you've got to relax. If you're still panicked and worried and you're still triggered, so over 24 hours, you are a different brain looking at that problem. So I think, you're spot on with that one.
And I like what you said about the neuroscience. I love that. I rely on people that are smarter than myself in items like that of science, like yourself. But it is, for me, I go back to when I was a personal trainer, I just explain it very simply as the more you practice something, the easier it becomes. It's the power of repetition. The more you lift a weight at a certain number of repetitions at a certain weight, the easier it's going to get over time. So the more we practice whatever tool it is that we pick up, the easier it's going to be.
We talk a lot here on Only Human about habit formation. And you're exactly right. I mean, experience only works for you if you're doing the right thing during the period of time you're calling experience, right? It's why in our aviation world, every once in a while, I'll give you an example. Southwest Airlines guys, this is, probably 20 years ago now, landed long, hot with a tailwind on a wet runway out in Burbank, I think, and slid off the end of the runway, right? Just totally bad judgment, downwind landing, unstable approach, continued landing, slid off the end of the runway. Might not have been Burbank, but at any rate, the next day, the Southwest Airlines public affairs officer came out and she said, "We don't understand exactly what happened because these were two of our most experienced pilots." Now, all of us in the profession, at least the pilots of us in the profession, thought, I can tell you exactly what happened. You know what they had been experiencing? Salvaging shitty approaches for 20 years. They had built the repetition of salvaging bad approaches. So experience doesn't automatically equal judgment. And when you're talking about repetition, I think it's important to remind our listeners that we're talking about repetition of doing it right, taking that 24-hour pause, taking a deep breath. All of those things I think are vitally important. So you've got all these skills, right? And I get a lot of questions down the line of, well, if you know so much about this, Tony, why is your life still all screwed up? Which I actually have a lot of answers for. But
we're human.
So what still frightens you? What is your biggest fear right now? It doesn't have to be, obviously, don't tell us anything. I'm afraid the cops are going to find out.
No. No, because this is being recorded, you said, right?
That's right. We can edit that out.
I think just as a parent, it's anything to do with my kids and their future. And I have to remind myself that, you know what? They've got their own God, right? They've got their own higher power. And I know that, it's okay for me to speak a little bit about that, but, and I know you do as well a little bit, but that's what I have to remind myself of. But if I'm being truthful, if you ask me right now as a mom, that's the one that always gets me.
Yeah, I think, I think men may look at it different than women. I don't know if they're allowed to say that anymore, but I've always feared falling off the ladder that I have built for myself, for my family, right? I always try to, there's a lot of people, they'll make a step up and they'll get a promotion or they'll do something new in their life, and they reach a point where they stop dreaming and they are satisfied, right? And I've never reached that point, nor do I ever want to reach that point. But there's something to be said for those that do, because when they reach that point, they solidify everything around them. They're rock solid on that point. I'm just enough to take one more step, and I'm ready to go and do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And so I always fear the metaphor of that rung that I'm on breaking, and then all the ones.
I can so relate to that. Maybe people will call it, imposter syndrome, whatever the case may be. But I always refer to it as like, when is the carpet going to be ripped out from underneath me? Like things are going way too good right now. So I hear you on that.
Yeah, I just think, I guess the reason I make that point is that I think all of us are driven by fear, right? What we can't allow, and what you address so eloquently in your books, is fear to paralyze us or to move us off center so much that, in some cases we need professional help. And if that's the case, you obviously ought to go get it. But I think the earlier we learn that fear is a natural thing, and that even though it can be a very uncomfortable thing, we should learn to embrace that. Right? And I'm not just talking about fear of spiders. I'm talking about general anxiety that's out there about things, right? And so we have to learn to live with that. And unfortunately, there are far too many people out there that can't live with it, and so they take a pill, or they drink another shot of whiskey, or they smoke another joint, or they find some other way to address their fears and anxiety than the wholesome way, the right way, the way that comes from your core. Does that make any sense to you?
It makes total sense. So, people will say, I don't know if you've ever heard this, that people pick up a spirit to get closer to their true spirit.
No, man, but I want to lay some wisdom on me here, man.
I think, I only bring this up again because if people can pick up the language I'm talking about, then you'll know that I've been sober since 2017. So a lot of what I used to pick up, for me, it was alcohol. I didn't drink often, but when I did, I liked to party. I quickly recognized after I lost my mom that, I had to make a decision there. Like, I'm not going down that road. I don't want to pick up another drink if I'm, feeling like celebrating. I want to actually celebrate. I want to honor who I truly am. And I need to know that there's a different way and there's a different path in life. So, so much of what you just shared, just in that, it just hit me because, again, I don't always share that I'm in recovery on a show. I guess I'm being a little courageous doing that. But I also think it's important because when it comes down to it, courage is sharing a little part of your heart. And that's a huge part of my heart. My foundation right there is my sobriety, and has led me to everything good in life. So, so for that, I think like just taking that mask off of picking up things that just aren't healthy is huge. That was when I really discovered that it's okay to be quirky. It's okay to be anxious. It's okay to be all those things you were trying to cover up before. The important thing is addressing it and trying to just do a little better and sharing that with other people, helping another person. That's why I wrote those books. It's not about becoming some famous author. That doesn't matter. The connections matter. So that's just what it's all about for me, is sharing your heart.
So thank you for sharing that. And, Something we haven't had a chance to talk about, and we're running out of time here, so we'll have you back if you're willing. But is that whole piece of authenticity? And I know you're right about that. So what I'm tempted to do here is, in my feeble little way, having looked through your books and tried to pull out the major lessons from them that we didn't get a chance to talk to. I want to summarize 2 or 3 of the points that I got out of it. You tell me what I missed. I'll give you the final word, and then we'll wrap this up for our listeners. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. So the first one is healing through trauma, right? I think, the story about your mom, and many of us have had serious losses, the loss of a family member unexpectedly and in a harsh way, or a health scare, things that you've been through and things that you describe, how you fought through that. So healing through trauma is sort of the first one, but I think healing is way too shallow for what you advocate. You advocate that you actually come out the other side more powerful. And I don't call that resilience, right? Everybody loves that word resilience. Resilience means bouncing back to where you were, right? That's almost the definition of the Newtonian physics of it. You were resilient, rubber band comes back to where it was. That's not what you're saying. What you were saying, and you can tell me, no, Tony, that's complete bullshit. That was what I was saying. But what I think you were saying is that you build greater inner strength, right? And that personal growth through pain brings you out the other side with a new set of skills, a new appreciation, right? You have taken that experience, that dreadful experience, and made something positive out of it. And since you mentioned the Lord, I'll mention it here. I think that's why He gave us the type of minds that we have. We have the ability to choose despair or hope. We have the ability to choose good or evil. And so what I see here in your approach is the way to choose hope. And not only choose it, but to execute it, right? So what did I miss?
Well, nothing. You said it all. That is so true. It just made me think of that saying we used to make me cringe. And I know people's intentions were only good. Right after losing my mom was, time heals, time heals. Well, it doesn't. Time only heals when we do the work. And it's what you do in that time that's going to matter. And I like how you said that it's how we're going to execute that hope. Faith is an action word. What are the action steps we're going to take to get through the other side better than we were before? I
think I'll get this wrong, and all the navigators out there, they memorize Bible verses. I can't. But James, the brother of Jesus, half brother of Jesus, said, what faith without action is nothing, or something like that. I'll have to
no faith at all. Yeah, it's what you said.
Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up here. Valerie, thank you so much for joining us. And I think the listeners got a whole lot out of what we're talking about. I think the takeaways on knowing yourself is that this isn't just something that that's an intellectual exercise for us or an academic exercise. It's something that when we get hit the hardest in life, we have an opportunity to make the biggest gains from, right? And so I think this is kind of a really fulcrum episode in our season this year. And we're going to talk a little bit more about fear and a little bit more about courage in the next couple of podcasts and go deeper with some more examples. Everything like nowadays, pilots have to train on something called startle effect. Why? To overcome that initial fear from something that happens that shouldn't have happened in this highly automated, safe world of aviation. That's a new term because guess what? For a long time, bad things happened to pilots a lot. And so there was no such thing as a startle effect. It was called complacency. But now we've put a new term on it. Anyways, we'll walk through a lot of different things as we go forward in these two areas. And Valerie, I think you've really opened the door and opened my eyes on how we can use these experiences. And I hope that you'll agree to come back on at some point in the future, and we'll talk deeper about some of these things. I'll leave the last word to you. Anything that you'd like to say to close this out?
I just want to say I really appreciate people like yourselves, providing platforms like this to speak about these, very important topics. And to your listeners, like, you're doing it right now. Your show, Human Factors, is one tool, right? They can pick up every day to fill your mind with really good stuff. So I appreciate all you do, Tony. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Valerie. All right, everybody. So you've kind of already heard the tease for next week. It's going to be either courage or fear, followed by fear or courage. We talked about what they're like in the absence of another, in the absence of the other. And the last little peek inside that is we're going to talk about recklessness and how that comes to be, at least some of the things we've been able to learn from it. Like always, please be all you can be, getting better every day with the resources at hand, where you are, with whom you are. And we had a great episode here today. I really look forward to you all coming back. So I will see you soon.